So in this first sentence here, or this first clause, after Romulus became king of Rome, one of the best ways that we could translate this would be with an ablative absolute, because an ablative absolute is often used to mean after something had happened. Now, if we were going to do that, we would start with the name Romulus, which is Romulus in Latin, and we'd have to put it in the ablative case, so Romulo, so it's second declension ablative. Then king of Rome, so king is rex, and then of Rome, so the name of the city of Rome in Latin is Roma, but in this case it's of Rome, so we need it to be Romae genitive case. And then we want a participle that means having become. Now normally you can't do that in Latin because perfect participles are usually passive, but in some cases you can if the verb is deponent. So, and that's what we have here. So the verb to become is fio, fieri, factus sum. So that perfect tense, factus sum, is deponent. So we can use that participle factus, and we would need to put it in the ablative case to agree with Romulo. So Romulo rex Romae facto. That's a very nice way of translating that first phrase. Except there are, of course, other ways of doing it. So that's one good way. Another good way, if you prefer, is just to use a normal temporal clause with postquam, so after something had happened. So here you would just put Romulus in the nominative case, and then you do again rex Romae, and then you would do became, not as a participle, but just as a perfect tense verb. So in this case, it would be factus est, right? It's a deponent verb, and that's what it looks like in the perfect tense. So either one of those would be fine. And then in the next phrase, he at first had no women in his city. Okay, so in Latin, we don't need to translate he, because that's just contained usually in the verb. So we would go to at first, which in Latin is primo. And then the verb we normally put at the end. So the next thing would be to translate the object, which is no women. So no is nullus. And then woman is femina. But then we need to make sure that we get the endings right. So here, because it's the object and it's plural, so we need accusative plural feminas, and then we have to make nullus agree with that. So nullas feminas. Then we can do in the city. So in is in plus ablative. City is urbs, urbis. And here we want the ablative. So since it's a third declension noun, the ablative is urbe. And then he had, here we can use the imperfect tense because we're talking about a general situation over a period of time rather than a one-off event. So the verb is habeo, habere. And we want here the imperfect tense. So habebam, habebas, and in the third person singular, habebat. So that gives us that second clause. And then in the next sentence there, the Romans themselves. Okay, so Roman is Romanus, and here we want it in the plural, so Romani. And then himself is ipse, although again it has to be plural, so ipsi. Now at that time, so there's two ways of doing this in Latin, one of which, let's just use the first one first, so let's just use at that time. We can use an ablative for time when. So remember with time phrases, you have accusative for time how long, you have ablative for time when or time within which. So in this case, that time would be id tempus, that time, but we need it to be ablative. So eo, and then tempore, at that time. And then were brave but few. So we'll put the verb at the end. So we'll say brave, which is fortis, or in the plural fortes, but few is sed pauci, and then the verb is erant, they were. Or if you wanted to, you could have a perfect tense fuerunt, but here, again, we're talking about a state of affairs over a period of time, so erant is probably better. And then the other thing is eo tempore, meaning at that time. You could also translate just with the word tum, meaning then, or at that time. So either of those two options is fine. Then in this next sentence, the king therefore. So the king in Latin is rex, and therefore is igitur, which, as in English, comes second in the sentence. So the king, therefore, decided to obtain wives for his citizens. So we can put the verbs at the end. So I think the next thing to translate would be the object, which is the wives. So a wife is uxor, uxoris, third declension. So the accusative plural is uxores, like that. And then we can translate for his citizens. So a citizen is civis. So his citizen would be civis suus. But then we need this to be in the dative plural because we want to say for his citizens. So civis is third declension, so the dative plural is civibus, whereas suus is second declension, so the dative plural is suis. So civibus suis, for his citizens. And then we can put the infinitive to obtain. Now the verb to obtain is adipiscor, and it's deponent, so it looks passive, and therefore the infinitive is adipisci. So that is an infinitive which looks present passive, but because it's deponent, it has an active meaning. And then finally, we need the verb decided. So the verb to decide is constituo, but we want the perfect tense constitui, and then we want third person singular, so constituit. And then in the next phrase, so that these women could bear children. Now, so that introduces a purpose clause. And in Latin, there's various ways of doing purpose clauses, but the most basic one here would be ut plus subjunctive. So that, ut, these women, okay, so this woman would be haec femina, but we want the plural, so hae feminae, so that these women, and then we can do the object so that the verb is at the end. So the object is children, so children in Latin is liberi, but if we want the object, then it needs to be accusative plural, liberos. And then the verb in Latin to bear children, to have children, is creare, like to create in English. And we want the imperfect subjunctive. And the way you form the imperfect subjunctive is by taking the infinitive, creare, and then you add the endings mst, mus, tis, nt. And here you want the nt ending because it's third person plural. And that's the end of the sentence. Now remember, in Latin, the tense of the subjunctive depends on whether the first half of the sentence was present tense or past tense. So in this case, the first half of the sentence, constituit, he decided, is past tense, and therefore we have a past tense subjunctive in the second half of the sentence, in the purpose clause. If, on the other hand, the first half had been present tense, then we would need a present subjunctive here. So if here we had the present tense, which actually would look the same, we only know here it's perfect because we're translating from English where it's perfect, but if this had been present tense constituit, then here we would have to have creent, so we'd have to have the present subjunctive. Anyway, going on to the next sentence there. So he hoped. Now to hope in Latin is spero, sperare, but here we want perfect tense third person singular, so speravit. Now, this verb to hope introduces an indirect statement. So what we do is that we put Rome into the accusative case, and then we put would have into an infinitive. And it's going to be a future infinitive because it's a hope for the future. So first of all, we put Rome, which is Roma, into the accusative, so Romam. And then we also have in this way as well, which in Latin is seek. So we could put that before Romam if we want. He hoped that in this way Rome would soon, so now we can do soon, which is mox. And then let's do the verb at the end. So let's say more soldiers. So more is plures in the plural. And remember that in English we say more soldiers, but Latin says more of soldiers, which is called a partitive genitive, more of soldiers. So therefore the word miles, which is a soldier, we need to put in the genitive plural. So the genitive singular is militis, so it's third declension. So the genitive plural is militum. And then, so that gives us more soldiers. So now we need would have, so we need a future infinitive. And the way that you do that is you need to find the fourth principal part of the verb. So the verb to have is habeo, habere, habui, habitus. That's the fourth principal part. And then for the future, instead of us, you have urus. So that's the future participle. And then you have the infinitive of the verb to be, esse. And there's just one more change that we have to make, which is that this is a participle, habiturus, so it has to agree with the noun that it's referring to. And the noun that it's referring to is romam. So therefore we need to make this feminine accusative singular just like romam. So habituram esse. They hope that Rome would have. So those two have to agree together. And so this is an indirect statement. So very literally, he hoped Rome to be about to have more of soldiers. That's how it works, very literally. Okay, then if we go into the next sentence, and so, like in Latin, and so is itaque. And then he invited, so to invite in Latin is invito, invitare, but here we want the perfect tense, third person plural. So invitavit, he invited. And then the Sabines, so the Sabines in Latin are Sabini, but here they are the object, so Sabinos, accusative plural. He invited the Sabines. And then this verb to invite in Latin, invitare, is followed by ut and subjunctive. So he invited them to, and then we'll put that verb at the end. So now we can say to, and then we can say with their sons. So cum, now a son is filius, but we want here the ablative plural because cum always takes ablative. So cum filiis. And then when we say and daughters, we say et. And then, now this is a slightly unusual word because the word for a daughter is filia. And the Romans, grammatically, the ablative plural should be filiis, but the problem is that that's the same as the ablative plural filius. So in order to distinguish these two, the Romans used a slightly irregular ablative plural for filia. So the ablative plural often for filia is filiabus. So filiis et filiabus. And in fact, another way of doing this, instead of et, would be to remove the et and to put the letters QUE at the end of the second word, filiabusque, and daughters. And then we want two public games. So we'd have two is ad plus accusative. Public games in Latin are ludi, or in the accusative ludos. And then all we need is the verb to come. So in this case, the verb is venire. And here we want the imperfect subjunctive. So you take that infinitive and you add the endings mst, mus, tis, nt. So in this case, it would be nt because the Sabines are plural. And again, remember that in Latin, the tense of the first half of the sentence influences the tense of the subjunctive in the second half. So if this had been present tense, he invites, invitat, then this would have to be present subjunctive, so veniant. But because this is perfect tense, this can also be a past tense as well, an imperfect subjunctive. Then in the next sentence, so we have they arrive. Now the verb to arrive is advenio, advenire. Third principal part is adveni, that gives us the perfect tense. And then we need the third person plural ending, so advenerunt. And then suspecting nothing. So let's put the verb at the end. So nothing is nihil. And then the verb to suspect is suspicor, which is deponent. But for the, and it's suspicari, it's a first conjugation verb. So the present participle is just suspicans. But that would be singular, and this needs to be plural because it's they arrived, suspecting nothing. So suspicantes for that plural participle there. Then in the next sentence, when everyone was watching the games, now you could here use ubi and then an imperfect tense verb, or even dum with a present tense verb, but a very nice way of translating this sentence would be with an ablative absolute, with everyone watching the games. So everyone is omnes, but in the ablative we want omnibus. And then for the games are the object of the verb, so therefore ludos, again, as we had before, accusative plural. And then watching, the verb is spectare, the participle is spectans, but we want plural because it's everyone, and we also want ablative because it's an ablative absolute. So that would be spectantibus. So with everyone watching the games, the daughters, so a daughter is filia, plural filiae, and then after that we can have by the Romans. That might be the next thing to do. So the Romans is Romani, but in order to say by the Romans, you need a or ab plus ablative. So we need to put the Romans into the ablative case, Romanis, by the Romans, and then suddenly we can have the adverb. Suddenly is subito, and then they were seized. Okay, so the verb is capio, I seize, but we want here the perfect passive. So what you do is you need the fourth principal part of the verb. So if you check in the dictionary, you'll see four principal parts: capio, capere, capi, captus. So there's the fourth principal part. And then you need to take the present tense of the verb to be. So captus sum, captus est, capti sumus, capti estis, capti sunt. So we need sunt for third person plural. And the other thing is that this captus here is a participle, so therefore it is like an adjective. It has to agree with filiae. So capti sunt. They were captured. Or in fact, if we want to say seized, a better word actually might be rapio, so therefore rapti sunt. That would work perhaps even better. And then in the next sentence, the Sabines are the subject, so Sabini. Now, if you look at this sentence, they were so angry that what this is going to need is a result clause. So, the word in Latin that means so in the context of result clause right? So plus an adjective is tam, and then angry is iratus. But in this case, because the Sabines are plural, it's going to be irati, plural. So that's the Sabines, and then so angry, and then we need were, so erant. So the Sabines were so angry. Or again, you could have fuerunt if you wanted the perfect tense. They were so angry that, and the word which introduces the result clause itself is ut. So they were so angry that. And then the verb they began we'll leave to the end. So let's do wage war, which is bellum gerere. That's a sort of fixed idiom, to wage war, bellum gerere, to wage war. Then they began. Okay, so the verb to begin is koipi, and it's a weird verb because it doesn't really have a present tense. It just exists in the perfect and pluperfect tenses. So koipi, and here what we want is a perfect subjunctive, right? We want subjunctive because we're in a result clause, and we want perfect because this is an action that did happen at a fixed time in the past. So what you do is you take that perfect stem, C-O-E-P, and you add the endings. So, and the endings are erim, eris, erit, erimus, eritis, erint. And in this case, it's going to be erint because it's third person plural. So koiperint. Then in the next sentence, the daughters, however, so a daughter again is filia, and here it's plural, so we have filiae. And then however is tamen. Then who loved, so this introduces a relative clause, qui. So qui is the relative pronoun, but here it's not going to be qui, it needs to be plural because the daughters are plural, and it also needs to be feminine, and it also needs to be nominative. So that's quai. So the daughters who. Now, loved is the verb, so we'll leave that to the end, and let's do the object. So both their new husbands and their fathers. Okay, in Latin, to say both one thing and something else, you repeat the word et. Yeah, et something else. So we have the first et, and then their new husbands. So new husbands, new is novus, and a husband is, you could use the word vir, or you could use the word maritus. So we can use maritus here. Now, in this case, the husbands are plural, and they're also the object. So they're going to be novos, accusative plural, maritos, again accusative plural, and their fathers. So father is pater, but again we want the accusative plural, so that's patres. It's third declension, so patres. And then if you want to say there, you could also use suos if you want, but in Latin you don't need to do that. So et novos maritos, et patres, and then finally we need the verb, which is going to be, so the verb to love is amare, and here we can use the imperfect, third person plural, so amabant, or if you wanted to, you could use the perfect tense amaverunt, but we can stick with the imperfect for now. And then persuaded them. Okay, so them is this pronoun is, ea, id. And in this case, since them is the object, we could say eos temporarily. We'll change that in a moment, but for now let's say eos. And then to persuade, the verb to persuade in Latin is persuadeo, and we want the third person plural perfect tense. So check the principal parts, persuadeo, persuadere. Then the third principal part, which is the perfect tense, is persuasi. So persuasi. And then you want the third person plural. So just run through those perfect tense endings in your mind. I, isti, it, imus, istis, erunt. Okay, but then there's also another important thing to remember about the verb persuadeo, which is that it takes dative instead of accusative. So therefore we can't have eos, we need to have the dative plural of that pronoun, which is eis. So eis persuaserunt. And this verb to persuade is followed by ut and subjunctive. So they persuaded them to ut, and then we'll leave the verb to the end. So we'll do the weapons first. Weapons in Latin are arma, which here is neuter accusative plural, the weapons. And then to put down, the verb is deponere. And here we're going to have the imperfect subjunctive. So you take that infinitive and you add the endings mst, mus, tis, nt. And in this case, it's third person plural, so deponerent. And again, it's worth remembering that the tense of the subjunctive here is dependent on the tense of the first half of the sentence. So if this word, to persuade, were present tense, then this subjunctive would also be present tense. So here you'd have persuade them, right? So you'd have persuadent, and then here you would have deponant. You'd have present subjunctive. But in this case, because you've got a past tense here, you have a past tense in the second half as well. Then, in the last sentence, for, so for in Latin is nam, they said dixerunt. So the verb is dicere, dico dicere, but again, we need the perfect tense. So look the verb up in a dictionary, you'll see the four principal parts: dico, dicere, dixi, dictum, so, or dictus. So there's the perfect tense, dixi, and here we want third person plural, so dixerunt. There's also another word in Latin that means for, in this sort of context, which is enim, but remember that enim needs to go second in the sentence, so it would be dixerunt enim. But we can use nam for the moment. So nam dixerunt, they said that they were now living happily in Rome. So they said that is an indirect statement. So what you need to do is you need to put they in the accusative, and then you need to put the verb living in the infinitive. So they is say in Latin. They said that they. Now you could use eas, the pronoun is ea id, but that would refer to someone else, right? That would mean the women said that they, some other group of women, were now living happily. But in this case, the women are referring to themselves, right? They said that they themselves were now living happily. So therefore you use the reflexive pronoun. They said that they, say, were now, right? Now for now in Latin we can use the word jam or nunc if you want, but I think now is, jam is quite nice because it means by now, right? By this point. They were now. Now let's leave the verb to the end. So let's say happily. So happily, you could use an adverb like feliciter, but often where we use an adjective where we use an adverb in English, the Romans use an adjective in Latin. So laetus here, and because it has to agree with say, so therefore it has to be feminine accusative plural. So laetas, so they said that they were living happily, so those two agree together, say and laetas. And then in Rome, remember you don't say in Roma, because Roma has a special locative form that means in Rome, which is Romae. And then finally, you need the verb to live, which is habito. And you need it, because we're an indirect statement, you need it in the infinitive, habitare. Now, one thing to mention here is they were living, right? That sounds like the past in English, they were living. So you might think that you want a past tense infinitive here, but you don't. And the reason that you don't is because the two ideas of them saying and them living are simultaneous, right? And that's what the present tense here in Latin is expressing. So the women said that they were at that time living, right? So the saying and the living are simultaneous, they're happening at the same time. The women are talking about their situation at the present time for them. And that's what this present tense is doing in Latin, habitare. Habitare does not mean, just because it's present, it doesn't mean that it's happening now, as in, in the 21st century or at the time of the narrator. What it expresses is that this living business is happening at the same time as that main verb, dixerunt. So the idea of the present tense in Latin is more about two things being simultaneous than it is about something happening right now at this very moment. So therefore, we use the present tense there. And imagine if you did a very literal translation, it would be the women said themselves to be living. And that's what you want. If you used a perfect infinitive, it would be the women said themselves to have lived. In other words, the women said that they had previously lived. And that's not what you want. What you want is to express these two actions being simultaneous with each other. So therefore, you use the present tense in that context.